Can studying historical sources make your fencing worse? Let's find it out. Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today I want to answer back to my fellow HEMA tuber HEMA Fight Breakdowns and to his video about the topic I just mentioned before. Is it true? Can studying sources actually make you worse at fighting? Well, in short, the answer is yes, it may happen. HEMA Fights Breakdowns expands on this topic quite a lot, so first of all I suggest you to watch his video later, as it is full of interesting thoughts on this topic, with which I agree for the most part. Now I'll expand a little on certain arguments he touched and I'll tell you why, in my opinion, this apparently controversial topic is not controversial at all, and it is the truth, actually. First of all, let me introduce you to a simple concept. Now imagine that you have to tighten a screw. Ideally, you should do it with a screwdriver, but you can't because you don't have your toolbox available, and so you decide to improvise something. You try out with a coin, then with your keys, and after some struggles you find one which fits and makes enough leverage. And finally, after swearing enough, you get the job done. You needed 20 times the time you would have needed by doing it with a screwdriver, but in the end, you made it. Now, this is exactly what a lot of HEMA fencers and instructors did in the past 30 years. This assuming that their goal was recreating some functional and useful technique applicable in a non-collaborative fight simulation. We tried to make something work in a context completely different from the one the manuals were meant for. And I'm not even talking about fighting, I'm talking about training. Fighting is 99% about training, planning and organizing, and only 1% about actual fighting. In the greatest majority of contexts, you can ask it to a soldier or a professional MMA fighter or a boxer. The same was back in the days. They trained in a way which was, first of all, possible and then safe enough to be carried out in a context in which, most probably, training per se was extremely complex to carry out compared to these days. Some training manuals actually show this without pointing it out. Of course, it was obvious there wasn't an alternative to it. Control was there sometimes, such as in the scambiare di punta, the exchange of thrusts of your delivery, which is a stop thrust on tempo which became a parry riposte with a billion steps to exercise proper control on it and land it in training safely. Other times, certain risky motions, such as an offensive thrust toward the face, were modified in a safer while geometrically similar action. An example is punta falsa, punta curta, which means fake thrust, short thrust. The fake thrust is modified into a horizontal cut to the head, same ending position, same defensive action required to counter it, but easier to control if compared to stepping with a point on line toward the training partner face, as the cut comes from outside the figure and so it is easier to check and control. Other times the target changes, such as in the first place of the Schilhau described by Ringek. Ideally it is a stop thrust, but it is made in a safer way by changing both the nature of the strike and the target by going to the shoulder with a cut. Another manual, which we refer to as von Danzig, tries to advise for a cut toward the head landed most probably with control. Another master, Jude Lev, seems to use another approach to safety. He most probably used distance. In fact, he advises to step forward while landing the defensive action, something which would be not useful at all if the opponent would strike you at your figure. All the three ways of landing the Schilhau add a follow-up to the play which clearly suggests that the ideal is to stop thrust. But was it possible back then to train such a risky motion? Most probably the answer is no. In fact, the only thing I disagree with HEMA Fights Breakdowns is the topic of safety. They actually cared a lot about safety considering the context in which they were training. So much so that striking to the hands barely existed, and believe me, be it a first blood duel or a self-defense scenario, the hands are an easier target to reach than the head, while doing an equally important job in a fighting context. Plus, they are far more fragile. Considering that most of the HEMA injuries are to the hands nowadays, even considering how much we focus to make them safe with our modern equipment and safety standards, it tells us quite a lot about how they kept safety in high regards while training, and probably also how much hands protections they carried out while doing so, which is from minimal to none. Of course, remember, here we are talking about unarmored fighting training. Now, all of this considered, we have to agree that their possibilities of training and our possibilities of training are quite different if compared. And again, the tools used to train back in the days compared to the one we use right now are pretty different. Also, the time we can invest in training compared to what the average noble was able to invest is, again, radically different. And now we are back to the example of our screw. We needed so much time to unlock certain fighting skills simply because we based our understanding and training on top of 14th to 15th century training methods and goals to build up our understanding of fighting. And notice, not training, fighting, which will then be applied to the parameters and environments of our training methods and goals of nowadays. As you can understand, it's a pretty little mess, far from a linear progression of concepts, and that's why we needed a lot of time. And notice that who came first did nothing wrong at all. They did their best with the tools available. This was the only way possible to build up HEMA as we know it for what it is today. But here I want to point out something else too. For our ancestors, 600 years ago, getting the job done wasn't easier at all. They needed all the artifacts I mentioned above, plus more, to make training possible. And the more artifacts you have, the more your training is detached from reality of fighting, which means that you have to invest even more time into training to make it useful than what you will do with better artifacts, training tools, and so on. What I am telling you is that for them, tightening the screw with a coin was mandatory. It wasn't plan B at all. It was the plan. So what all of this means? Well, it means two things. The first one is that the training methods of our ancestors were most probably far from being better than our ones in most of the cases, because of technology, safety standards, and healthcare solutions to injuries. They probably compensated this with more artifacts to enhance safety and with far more time spent training, thanks of course to their social status and related roles, to enhance skill development. And of course, last but not least, with the fact that they were able to witness real violence with a certain degree of regularity, thus making their training useful and necessary, making for what in Italy we call far di necessità virtù, which translated sounds like to make a virtue out of a necessity, as there is no better motivation to become good at something than pure and plain necessity. The second thing that it means is that our ways of developing HEMA were messy and confused. We didn't have a specific goal save for reconstructing the ancient ways of fighting, which as far as it sounds cool, it's impossible without the fighting component, which I bet no one of us would be eager to apply to. I mean, sacrificing some limbs or life for science. So we set up a sparring-based environment with tournament on top to compensate for the lack of fighting as the ultimate goal and motivation to train. And to carry out training and sparring safely, we developed specific tools using our modern technologies. These, on one side, improved our possibilities to apply certain historical actions, sometimes in the way they were probably meant to be landed in the first place, such as the one I described before, for instance. While other times this choice modified our way of applying techniques due to our sparring environment and specialization, again, due to the tools, safety requirements, and so on, thus creating a new fencing environment of its own. This is not something new, of course. This happened all throughout history, such as in the factual times with their competitions and such. So, can studying sources make us worse at fencing? Well, the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes not. But the flavors, let's call it, of yes and no are as much as the variables I mentioned above. Yes and no for safety, yes and no for tools, yes and no for poor understanding, yes and no for different application environments, and so on and so on. After years of HEMA, I find our historical sources an extremely valuable source of technical advices. But this is only because of my 13 years of experience with HEMA and various martial arts. Sometimes I find a technical solution for a certain situation in a part of a manual which talks about everything besides that specific situation. This is because, again, of the many reasons I described above. But if I look back at what these sources did for me 10 years ago, looking at them with my today's understanding of the matter, well, they made me move forward, yes, but very, very slowly. They sometimes gave me objectives impossible to achieve and tasks impossible to accomplish. They gave me techniques, but sometimes applied at the wrong time or at the wrong distance. They gave me an over-idealized view of fighting to pursue. But it wasn't their fault. It was my lack of understanding. As you have seen, to understand these sources, you needed to see through the matrix, if you know what I mean. And to be able to do it, you need thousands of hours of practice and studying, hundreds of errors, and the ability to admit them. And, well, a lot of patience. So, long story short, the historical sources make you worse at fighting if you don't know already how to fight. If you know how to fight and you're not able to read through them, they become neutral, let's say. And if you know how to fight and you're able to read through the sources, they become your greatest ally, and you will be able to enjoy their teachings and their historical flavor and the romantic idea much, much more than if you try to learn how to fight through them. So, find a club first, find a good instructor, learn how to fight first, and then, only then, put on your glasses, run the engines of your brain, and stick your nose into the sources. You will not regret it. Believe me. Very good people, we are at the end of this video. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon page, link in the description if you want to support me and if you want to see more of my content. Again, thanks for watching and see you next time.